Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the Collaborative Effect. This research was led by Vital Impact, Redstone Strategy Group, and Philanthropy Together with generous support from the Hewlett Foundation. I'm Jess Love, Senior Vice President at Vital Impact.
And I'm Isis Krause, Chief Strategy Officer at Philanthropy Together. Thank you all so much for being here today. To enable closed captioning, please use the bottom of your Zoom screen and say hello in the chat.
This is going to be a packed hour of insights and learnings for our sector, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. We're joined today by Jahan Velji of the Hewlett Foundation, my colleagues and report co-authors Kathy Francis, Catherine Austin Evelyn, and David Young, and two wonderful guest speakers, Sneha Dave at Generation Patient and Nikki Brown Booker at Borealis Philanthropy. Many of us on this call have worked deeply in collaborative philanthropy, helping to design, launch, and implement these funds. In my years as a practitioner in the field, I have developed some strong opinions about what works and what doesn't, particularly where the rubber meets the road, which is helping grantee partners drive impact. I thought about sharing my ideas in an op-ed, but I realized it would be much more powerful to hear perspectives from the field directly. Looking out into the field, I saw that there was little research on the experience of collaborative philanthropy from the grantee perspective. As it turns out, many of us in the field had been asking similar questions. What practices do collaboratives employ that grantees experience as most impactful? They do a lot of things, but really what moves the needle? And how does the design of the fund support or impede their overall impact? I was convinced that the answers to these questions could help support donors in choosing which models to fund, and they could help fund leaders make smart design choices with limited resources. I approached Isis Krause from Philanthropy Together, who work deeply with collaborative funds around the world, and I asked these questions. Together, we've shaped an appreciative inquiry approach to answering them. Isis, thank you for joining me on this adventure.
Thank you so much, Jess. I'm so excited to be here with all of you today. We have over 1,000 folks who have registered for this, so I think this shows how much this was really hitting a chord for folks. Before we go any further, I know we have a big audience with us today, and so we wanted to set the stage for the growing context of collaborative philanthropy. As many of you know, collaborative funds have become increasingly important in the landscape. They allow funders to pool resources, align strategy, and take on really complex problems that any individual funder cannot alone. Bridgespan Group, upon which much of this research is built upon, has cataloged over 500 collaboratives around the world. And those groups together are giving more than $4 to $7 billion a year. So this is massive amounts of money. But many of them, 70%, have a racial or gender equity component to their work. As you'll hear more about, we used an appreciative inquiry process to help look at the funds in this field. We ended up with a cohort of 22 US-based mid-sized funds focused in the US, and you'll hear more about that in our methodology. These 22 funds alone are moving more than $200 million last year in 2024 to more than 1,700 grantees with just 133 staff. Of course, these aren't the only collaboratives we could have looked at, and we're so excited to be able to share more about our findings in this study. We hope that it offers a clearer and more evidence-based view about how collaboratives function in practice beyond the theory that Jess was talking about, specifically looking at the grantee perspective and experience. It elevates the voices of organizations most directly impacted by philanthropic practice, and it provides guidance to funders who want to understand what to look for in strong collaborative funds that are grantee-centered. And for collaborative fund leaders who want to strengthen their practice to be more grantee-centered, we hope that some of these findings are helpful for you as well.
Plan today will be to give you a high-level overview of the report, its methodology, and the 6 key takeaways. Then we'll hear from a grantee and a fund leader who contributed to the research to really bring the study to life. Finally, we'll open the floor for Q&A, and the questions function is actually open now, so you can begin dropping questions throughout the program. We'll answer them at the end. At the end, you'll also receive a link to the full report for you to download it, and we'll send it in a follow-up email as well. This work would not have been possible without our partners at the Center for Effective Philanthropy and the smart guidance of our advisory council, who are listed on this slide. It definitely couldn't have happened without funding. And so I'm happy to introduce Jahan Velji, Director of the Effective Philanthropy Group at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, to share a few words on the context and on their interest in this report. Jahan, welcome.
Thank you, Isis and Jess. It's a pleasure to join you all today. As Jess mentioned, I'm Jahan Velji, and I lead the Effective Philanthropy Group at William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. And really, one of the things my team focuses on is how to improve the practice of philanthropy, both at Hewlett and more broadly across the charitable sector. And one of the ways in which we do this is through our Future of Giving strategy. This strategy is aimed at increasing participation in philanthropy and improving the relationships between givers and nonprofits, both of which are necessary for nonprofits to have the resources they need to help people and the planet thrive. As we look across the landscape of giving, we see many different types of givers, including different types of institutions and people, individuals giving at different levels. We also see many different mechanisms for giving, including collective giving circles, tech platforms, and collaborative funds, among others. Collaborative funds really enable institutional and individual donors to combine and distribute philanthropic resources, and we've been interested in learning more about them because of their huge growth over the last decade and their potential for impact. At Hewlett, from performing arts to economic security, we see the potential for collaborative funds also to get resources to a broader range of organizations. And then, based on my own experience with collaborative funds, I've seen how they can be a platform for deeper partnership between givers and nonprofits. But when it comes to the research, while there's been a lot of focus on how collaboratives help donors, there's been less focus on the experience of grantees of collaborative funds. So that's why we supported this study, because we wanted to better understand what makes collaborative funds work best for the organizations they support. Like many of you, we were curious to learn more about what practices are helpful and supportive of impact, what practices can be improved, are there supportive practices that are unique to collaboratives, and what would it take for organizations getting support from collaboratives to feel better positioned to achieve the impact they're hoping for. We hope that through this research, we might be able to paint a clearer, evidence-based picture of what strong collaborative practice looks like from the grantee perspective, and simultaneously could advance our own practice as well as that of the field. And that's why I'm so excited about the research that's culminated in the collaborative effect. I'm eager to learn from the results, including what's different, what's consistent when it comes to understanding how to build deeper partnerships so nonprofits can be better supported by collaboratives. The potential for impact is there if we're willing to listen, learn, invest, and partner.
Thank you so much, Jahan, for your support of this work and for those kind words. Now we're going to bring up the other co-authors to the stage, and we're going to dive right in. Welcome, Kathy and David and Catherine.
Thank you, Jess, Isis, and Jahan. Before we get into it, the results, I want to talk a little bit about the methods of how the research was conducted. And for the goal of understanding what truly effective collaborative practice looks like, we used a bright spots design. This approach is rooted in an appreciative inquiry approach, and it looks for positive deviance. Rather than averaging across all the intermediaries, as previous research has done, we intentionally studied collaborative funds that field experts regard as operating at an incredibly high level. These kinds of bright spots approaches are particularly effective when we want to understand the key characteristics of a model that make something effective. It allows us to identify those practices that characterize the high-performing funds so that we can understand what it is that we want to lift up, replicate, and carry forward. So to understand these collaborative funds from multiple angles, we used a mixed methods design that integrated a range of data collection methods. We had a large-scale grantee survey, semi-structured interviews with fund leaders and staff, grantee focus groups to more richly and fully learn about their experiences with collaborative funds, and document review of strategy materials, guidelines, and evaluations. This combination ensured that our findings reflected a balanced view of grantee perspectives, funder intentions, and documented evidence of practice, not any single data set or perspective. I'll come back to the data collection process in a bit to more fully unpack what was involved in each of these. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about how we selected the incredible funds in this study. So to identify high-performing collaborative funds, we started at the wide end of the funnel with Bridgespan's landscape scan of collaborative funds and applied the inclusion criteria for the study, which were that the funds were US-based, they were mid-sized, and had at least 1 year of active grant making. This narrowed the pool to a selection of about 121 funds. Then to identify the bright spots, those funds known for strong governance, accountability, grantee orientation, field relationships, and operational capacity, we consulted our advisory council, funders, intermediaries, and other field leaders to nominate funds. This resulted in a sample of about 67. From there, we recruited our cohort, ensuring a diversity in issue area, structure, geographic focus, and origin story. The result was our wonderful cohort of 22 collaborative funds that have been partners to us throughout all of this work. They represent the diversity of models in the field. That said, I want to say this is an illustrative example of high-performing collaboratives, not a rank list or an exhaustive sample.
Kathy, we have a question already about mid-size. Before we go on, do you mind addressing what mid-size means in this context?
So in this context, mid-sized was 1 million to 50 million. It's a pretty large range, which reflects the field, but that was the criteria that we used. Okay, so a little bit more about the data that we collected. The backbone of the research was the CEP Grantee Perception Report, and we administered that survey, a customized version of it, to 21 of the 22 funds who participated. This resulted in over 1,400 surveys sent, and we received 647 responses back. This was a 44% response rate, which is fantastic. The surveys captured grantee perspectives on relationships, processes, assistance beyond the grant, DEI, and the value proposition of the collaborative using 7-point Likert scales. We then also developed 10 custom questions in partnership with the participating funds. These questions looked at more profound insights into the participatory practices, the grantee preferences, and experiences within the collaborative model. For the fund staff interviews and document review, we conducted 22 semi-structured interviews and analyzed grant guidelines, strategy documents, and internal materials to understand governance practices, decision-making, and operational structures. We also convened 4 focus groups with 22 grantees across all funds, exploring accessibility, value, and practice, and to really get the opportunity to listen deeply to those grantee perspectives. A few quick words about how we analyzed the data. The results throughout this report compare the cohort funds, our 22 Bright Spots collaborative funds, to the CEP's broader data set of more than 60,000 grantee responses to the Grantee Perception Survey from more than 350 funders over the last decade. The percentiles that we show and the significance values that we calculated were based on the 260 funders who were most recently surveyed. That is, funders who surveyed grantees in 2020 or later. When we say things like our cohort of funds performed in the top 10%, we're comparing them to all of these funders that have had their grantee take the CEP survey. These data suggest that the collaborative funds are perceived by grantees as performing at a similar level to the highest performing funders in the field. We tested statistical significance, focusing on 2 outcomes in particular. The first was the perceived impact on the grantee organization and the perceived impact of the fund on the field more broadly. All of the rich qualitative data in the study were coded in vivo to surface themes like governance, trust, accessibility, and field influence. And document review was used to triangulate the findings and identify concrete examples of the design choices that the funds made. I want to make a note on the limitations of what we were able to do here. The findings reflect grantee perceptions rather than an objective field-level outcome, And while they reveal meaningful correlations, they don't establish causation. Our aim is not to offer a one-size-fits-all formula that tells you to do this and get this outcome, but to surface the practices and conditions that consistently appear in the highest performing collaboratives so that others can adapt them and apply them to their own context. I'll hand it over to Catherine now to introduce the collaborative cycle and our findings.
Great, thanks. So let me start with the core finding that really kind of sets the stage for everything else that we're going to walk through today. What stood out most across the 22 collaboratives in our study is that the highest performing collaborative funds don't succeed because of any one single structure or innovation. They succeed because of the strength and quality of their relationships with their grantees. So grantees consistently describe these collaboratives as partners who understand their communities deeply, who show cultural and contextual fluency, and who operate with genuine values alignment at each stage of the grant-making partnership. So trust came up again and again, respect came up again and again, and for many grantees, these collaboratives felt like rare funder spaces where they didn't have to translate or justify the realities they're navigating. The collaborative funds in the study delivered impact through a distinctive model that we have named the collaborative cycle. So the cycle is driven by 5 mutually reinforcing elements that together explain how the funds in the study delivered outsized results. So I'll start by giving a quick visual overview on the slide here of the collaborative cycle. Once we analyze the entire data set, so the survey results, interviews, focus groups, and document review, we saw a very consistent pattern. Grantees kept describing these 5 elements, or the 5 Ps, as we call them. They are proximity, partnership, pathways, patterns of practice, and power. The cycle is not a theoretical model, it's a relational pattern drawn from grantee perceptions and documented practice. One of the most striking findings from the study is that collaborative funds are consistently delivering outsized impact, far beyond what their size or their resources would typically predict. These funds operate with lean teams and modest annual grant-making budgets, yet grantees rated them in the top 15% of all funders nationwide for advancing field knowledge, influencing public policy, and moving their fields forward. What this tells us about this impact is that it's a function of design, proximity, trust-based relationship, and shared power. So by being deeply embedded in communities, working in partnership rather than with oversight and investing in the ecosystem, not just individual grants, these collaboratives amplify their influence in ways that larger, more traditional funders often struggle to achieve.
First step in the cycle is proximity, which we define as a sense of closeness that goes beyond physical presence to include a deep understanding of grantees' goals and the realities that they are facing. Grantees describe these collaborative funds as genuinely part of the field. They perceive them as working alongside their grantees rather than positioned above them. We heard this framing surprisingly consistently in our qualitative research. And from the data standpoint, the CEP survey, the funds in this cohort were in the top 10% of all funders for understanding the populations served, the conditions shaping grantee work, and the strategy that is therefore required in the field. Put another way, the grantees of these collaborative funds are much more likely to feel that their funder understands them. What we found surprising is that it's not because they spend more time together. In fact, grantees of the funds that we studied had less frequent meetings with their funders than the average. But because they see these funders as peers, their conversations are more efficient. Because collaboratives already understand their contexts, grantees can spend far less time explaining or justifying their work, and they can move immediately into conversations about strategy. There is also a structural element to proximity. Like their grantees, collaborative funds have got to raise the money that they give away, and they experience the same challenges that come with fundraising. There are many reasons this can be tricky, but it also contributes to the feeling of being alongside their grantees.
For proximity, the next step in the cycle is partnership, which further looks at the nature of the relationship between the cohort funds and the grantees. This finding highlights that the relationship between them is bidirectional. It's marked by high levels of honesty, trust, and shared values. From the grantees' perspective, this kind of partnership is one of the structural drivers of their impact. In the research, we found that grantees consistently reported high levels of trust, honesty, and shared values. This manifested as low pressure and strong values alignment. Collaboratives were in the top 20% of all funds for openness to their ideas, and in the bottom 20% for pressuring grantees to shift priorities. This type of transparent, mutual relationship was supported by clarity from the funder about the values that drove their decision-making and how those values translated into practice. Statistically, trust had a significant correlation with both organizational impact and field impact. So partnership isn't just about relationships, it's also predictive of what the two organizations can achieve together.
Thank you, Kathy. Next up, it is all about pathways. So pathways are what expand access, legitimacy, and field influence and position grantees as leaders. Pathways happen when partnership translates across connections and relationships that are supportive of a grantee's needs. As this one grantee shared, being a part of that group introduced us to so many other partners with whom we continue to work with to this day, which means we now have a much deeper understanding of our organization's role within the broader ecosystem. Grantees describe collaboratives as connectors that open doors to peer networks and others like funders, technical assistants, consultants, philanthropy leader, experts, and others. One of the central questions we're often asked is whether collaboratives open doors for other funders to strengthen grantee work over time, or whether they keep those gates closed to other funders. In the CEP data, 83% of grantees that we surveyed said that their collaborative helped build relationships with other funders. For example, inviting them to field events, featuring their work in communications, making introductions, or including them in meetings with funders. And grantees were twice as likely to seek fundraising help from collaboratives compared to institutional funders. This, of course, can be strengthened so much further, and that was a consistent theme that in our surveys and the focus groups that grantees brought up. They are looking for more proactive introductions, more advocacy, more intentional networking with funders. This is really a call to action for our field. On the other side, funders often choose to invest in collaboratives because they prefer or are unable to manage direct relationships with that broader set of grantees. This is a live and really difficult question that this study doesn't answer fully, but it shows the pathway is one of the ways to do so. How can we intentionally and proactively have funding on-ramps to others? And what are the expectations of funders in your own collaborative? Further, grantees who believe that collaboratives open doors to networks that enhance their impact were then more likely to report higher over impact on the field. So this obviously doesn't establish causation, just correlation, but the findings suggest that networking, especially and particularly when funders act as connectors or amplifiers, is a really important factor in strengthening grantee impact.
Thanks, Isis. On that lovely note, the fourth step in the cycle is patterns of practice, which we define as a set of intentional, responsive practices that operationalize funds' commitment to the needs of their grantees. In other words, these patterns of practice are what breathe life into and make tangible the key values of proximity and partnership that we had talked about earlier. In particular, our findings illuminated three key patterns of practice. First, grantees appreciated the fund's intentional, dedicated effort to streamline grants to minimize administrative burden and provide stability to their grantees. In fact, survey data from our cohort suggests that grantees reported spending half as much time on both the application process and throughout the life of the grant compared to the broader set of funds at 12 hours versus 24 hours. And this extra time ultimately translates to more funds dedicated to serving the field, meaning more impact, meaning more time doing the work. Second, grantees deeply appreciated funds' practice of focusing on steady and responsive funding that helped them sustain core work and adjust in real time. Chief among them, our cohorts collaboratives are in the top 10% of funders who provide unrestricted support and top 17% for providing multi-year support. If there's anything to draw from this call, it's that these flexible multi-year grants from responsive collaboratives are what's needed by the field, as they were repeatedly highlighted as critical by many grantees. Outside of flexible multi-year funding, many grantees also highlighted the importance of early investment as an early validator for the rest of the field, in addition to rapid response support as a financial security blanket during moments of crisis. Third and finally, grantees highlighted how collaboratives beyond the grant support really strengthened their work. These non-financial supports include everything from invaluable strategic advising and technical assistance to peer learning cohorts and field building platforms. But what's important to note here is that above and beyond means different things to different grantees and different contexts. Some grantees need more funding quicker. Others need that technical assistance and coaching that comes with those non-financial supports. It's the discernment of responsive collaborative staff that strikes the balance and makes the magic happen. So all in all, it's these patterns of practice that solidify and reify collaboratives' commitment to what their grantee partners most need. And that brings us to the final part of our virtuous cycle.
So as we close the loop of the cycle, all of the practices we've discussed, proximity, partnership, pathways, patterns of practice, only hold if power is structured in a way that protects and reinforces the other elements of the cycle. So the strongest collaboratives didn't treat community voice as a value statement or an aspiration. They hardwired it into their governance model. So that meant that grantees and community members had real, not symbolic, decision-making power. Whether this was through formal structures or informal practices or a combination of the two, they were part of setting priorities, shaping strategies, and determining where dollars actually go. And what we saw is that when power is shared this way, it renews proximity. It keeps fund staff close to community realities. It strengthens partnership because strategies aren't abstract. They're rooted in what communities say they need and where they see the opportunity. It also guards against something that we often heard grantees talk about, which is the subtle pull of donor preferences that can crowd out community priorities. Inclusive governance interrupts that dynamic. Across the cohort, the collaborative scored extremely well on the pieces of transparency that matter most to grantees once they're inside the relationship. So they ranked in the top 10% of all CEP benchmarked funders for overall transparency and communications. They were also in the top third, or 36% of all funders in terms of clarity about how funding decisions are made and what criteria guide them. But, and this is an important but, the data also surfaced the limits of what lean collaborative teams can do. So these funds ranked in the bottom 30% of all funders on clarity around application steps, eligibility, and timelines. This isn't surprising if you know how collaboratives operate. Many are intentionally lean. They run on annual fundraising cycles, as we've discussed here, and they often prioritize deep relational work over formalized bureaucratic process infrastructure. But it does mean that there is room to strengthen the front door of the experience, especially for newer organizations and nonprofits trying to understand whether and how to engage collaborative funds. And it really leads to the larger point that we want to underscore here, which is that power is not a separate component of effectiveness. It's the scaffolding that kind of holds all of the other elements together. So here's what that looks like in practice, or what it can look like in practice. So on this slide, we're showing the spectrum of power sharing tactics that we saw across the collaboratives in our study. So one of the most important things that the data made clear is that power sharing isn't a single model. There's no one-size-fits-all structure. And you'll see that illustrated in the case studies that we share in the power section of the report. It's a set of choices, some formal, some informal, and some combination of the two, that together shape how community voice actually shows up in strategy and decision-making. So on the left, you see the most formal and structural expressions of power sharing. These are decision-making structures where grantees or community leaders hold real authority. These are collaboratives that have embedded power directly into their governance model. In the middle, you see advisory structures and practices. So these aren't decision-making bodies, but they very meaningfully shape strategy and decisions. And on the right is the most flexible category. Informal feedback practices. So these may look simple and straightforward, but grantees told us that these relational touch points often surface insights and ideas and shape strategy in real time, especially when staff are proximate and trusted. So the key takeaway here is that collaboratives don't express power sharing in the same way, and they don't need to. What matters the most is intentionality around accountability. So balancing engagement and input so that community priorities genuinely shape decisions.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So to review all of these 6 findings, again, we go back to the collaborative cycle. We really hope that this is a tool that the whole sector can use to evaluate and look at collaborative philanthropy. It's fundamentally relational. It's built on trust and reciprocity and shared purpose. And each of the P's, as hopefully you've seen in what we've just shared, is sustained by the quality of relationships between funders and grantees and communities. That in turn strengthens the relationships further. The highest performing collaboratives perform as well as the highest performing foundations. That's the key header of what we're sharing here. And what we've shared isn't an abstract framework. It captures the real patterns we heard directly from hundreds of grantees and leaders through the surveys and the focus groups on how to move resources more effectively and efficiently to strengthen the field. One of the most important takeaways is that it's not any single practice that drives impact. It's the interaction amongst all of them. We're not trying to say that you should just do patterns of practice or power or pathways. It's how these build on one another into a reinforcing loop that allows collaboratives to truly shine. And finally, while every collaborative operates in a different context, the patterns we identify offer a transferable principle to the field, ways of listening, partnering, sharing power, and approaching practice that honestly any funder, not just collaboratives, can apply to their work. And we know many strong funders are doing that already. Our hope is that these findings give the field both clarity and confidence around what to look for, a clearer picture of what effective collaborative practice can look like, and a more grounded path forward rooted in grantee experience.
So this research is only valuable if you put it into practice. With that in mind, our report has detailed recommendations for each of these audiences on the slide that's about to come up. In the new year, we will be holding invitation-only smaller conversations with foundations, with individual donors and their advisors, with fund leaders and hosts and grantees to really grapple with what these findings mean for their own unique context and to put them into practice. Stay tuned for that and follow our socials for more information and invitations to those conversations. But in the meantime, what I'll offer is a quick summary of the highlights. So for funders who are listening, we recommend that you select and increase support for funds that implement some or all components of the collaborative cycle. Don't be afraid to have the tough conversations to really assess whether your funds can demonstrate proximity to the communities they serve and whether they walk the talk with their grant-making practice. You can use this report and the collaborative cycle framework as a tool to guide those conversations. Treat collaboratives as your strategic allies and leverage their deep expertise to inform your own strategies. Finally, maximize flexibility in how you resource collaborative funds. Allow them to invest not only in grant making, but also in their own infrastructure and on the above and beyond supports that we described here. If you can, make multi-year commitments, which in turn will enable the funds to make long-term grants into the field. Where possible, be as flexible as you can with reporting so that the funds can reduce that burden as well. To leaders of new and existing collaborative funds on this call, we recommend that you invest in staff with deep expertise in the field and set expectations with your teams that these roles are fundamentally different than others in philanthropy. They're facilitative, not authoritative. Create formal and informal pathways for grantees to offer strategic input and be crystal clear about what those opportunities are. But don't let that input be a one-way street. Share what you learn back with your grantees because your field level perspective is something that they clearly value. Treat networking and matchmaking as strategic functions, not afterthoughts. Support your grantees in fundraising where you can, but be transparent about your constraints. And remember that sharing power through participatory decision making can be effective, but also don't assume that more participation is better. Whatever structure you choose, be sure to over communicate about your decision making criteria and processes to drive transparency wherever possible. The full report includes recommendations for hosts of fiscal sponsors, as well as reflections for grantees. But now let's hear directly from a fund and a grantee organization who are highlighted in the study.
Thank you so much, Jess. I have the sincere pleasure of being able to interview Sneha Dave and Nikki Brown Booker. Let me invite them both to the stage now for our conversation. Welcome, Nikki. Welcome, Sneha.
Hello, thank you.
Wonderful. So Nikki Brown Booker is the program officer of the Disability Inclusion Fund at Borealis Philanthropy, one of the 22 funds that we studied. And Sneha Dave is with Generation. She's the founder and executive director of Generation Patient, one of the grantees of the Disability Inclusion Fund. And what we're hoping to do in the next 10 minutes or so is provide a real example from this conversation around how that collaborative cycle shows up in practice at one fund. Of course, there are 21 other funds and dozens of others beyond our study that we could have highlighted, and we hope you dig into all of the funds in the report and in the Bridgespan database. But to start, I'd love to hear from you, Nikki, if you could give an overview around Disability Inclusion Fund's work, really focused on how some of those Ps come into practice for you.
Sure. So the Disability Inclusion Fund resources grassroots emerging grant nonprofits that are focused on supporting disability justice work around the country. Um, and our fund, we're like you said, we have three staff that fund our staff, and we all have disabilities ourselves. So speaks to that kind of close proximity to the ground. All of us have had experiences doing organizing, working in the field of disability before we joined the fund. And then we do what is called the participatory grant making model for choosing our fund, our grantees, and which also speaks to like another one of the P's, and that we have advocates that are within the field actually sit on in a grant making committee, and they're the ones that make the decisions about who we fund. So our staff doesn't make the decisions. It's actually the advocates that are in the field themselves making the decisions. So I'll stop there because I know we don't have a lot of time, and I want to be able to make sure that we have a full discussion.
Thank you so much, Nikki. And all of the P's, I love that. I think we're going to use that in an ongoing way. Sneha, welcome to the stage. Please share a little bit about your work at Generation Patient, and would love for you to dive in on your experience being a grantee of the Disability Inclusion Fund.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Sneha, and I am the executive director at Generation Patient, which is an organization representing the over 25 million young adults with chronic and rare conditions across primarily the United States, but also a bit internationally. And I started what is now Generation Patient when I was 13 years old, and I'm now 27, and it's been my first and only full-time job. And I say that because entering the nonprofit space and the fundraising space was very a huge learning curve, to say the least, and certainly a lot of language that I had to learn, and a lot of just barriers of power that I learned to navigate with the support of so many people. And the Disability Inclusion Fund was very unique in our first funder that was a collaborative philanthropy fund, and our first funder focused specifically on disability justice, which is the principles of our work at Generation Patient. And so as we were growing, and so we've been funded by the Disability Inclusion Fund, and Nikki has been my program officer for, I believe, the last 4 years now. So it's been a pretty long-standing relationship that I have had both with Nikki and the fund. And in the last 4 years, we've grown to doing over 650 peer support meetings and evaluation, and have led the creation of legislation entirely by the experiences of our community members, and our staff team is comprised entirely of disabled young adults. And I think the support of the fund has allowed us to focus more so on the work and what we are experts at, which is the programming and the challenges of our community. And where we've gotten support from the fund is certainly financially, and which allowed us to grow our impact, but also through, for example, smaller grants or ways that we could get support with accounting, for example. So, one of the requests that we had with the Disability Inclusion Fund was to be able to have nonprofit specific accounting and recommendations for nonprofit specific accounting firms. And that was incredibly influential because previous to that, I didn't even know that there were accounting firms that were specific to nonprofits and the unique aspects of grants management. Another huge aspect was me as a leader getting to have executive coaching. And so that was really huge for me because I had never previously managed staff before. And also, there's just so much in growing an organization that I would not have been able to, I guess, in some ways cope with without having someone that I could lean to for advice, for navigating just very specific challenges of being a young woman of color leader in a space where there's not enough of us. And so I think that was also really, really powerful and transformative for me and for the way that I would lead Generation Patient. And I think I need to speed this up, but
No, no,
I would
it's
also
perfect, Nate.
okay. Okay, great. Well, and then I would say, and this was very clear from the report, is just having a program officer, and I know Nikki's here, and I don't mean to flatter Nikki that much because you're really amazing and you're also on the call here, but it is such a transformative difference to have a program officer that inherently has a lot of trust, and that for me gives the confidence that we are trusted to hold the money to impact programs and meet the moment for our community. And that has been, I think, the best experience that we've had, that we don't have to have, monthly check-ins, for example. And we have been a part of funds where we've had to have, because we're a smaller budgeted organization, we've had to have monthly check-ins, and that becomes really difficult when we're so busy. And I believe sincerely that that is the power of a fund like the Disability Inclusion Fund, where there's program officers who have both lived experience but experience navigating similar professional workspaces, but also just the inherent trust that comes and the feeling that I can go to Nikki with any organizational question that I have because she has experience in that, but also she has resources for us to be able to navigate. And I think that's one of the things with small organizations is there's this misconception that we need trainings on everything. And I think instead of trainings, we need connections for people who can actually do the work. So, like accounting, cybersecurity audits, HR, there's so much that is hard to have to figure out yourself. And that is where the power of the fund comes in, is that it's oftentimes connectors, not only with those types of consultants and resources, but with, of course, other grantees. And we had a really powerful in-person grantee convening last year in Chicago with the Disability Inclusion Fund. And that was so cool to get to meet so many community organizations doing work that isn't always in the headlines or is not getting all the attention that it deserves, but just inherently because they're so focused on the work. And that was just so powerful to get to experience too. So those are just some of my reflections. And I think this research is so important and timely. And I would just urge everyone to feel a sense of trust with community organizations. I think there's a lot of hesitation sometimes in funding us, and just really grateful that the Disability Inclusion Fund did not look at age or any of those characteristics while deciding to fund us and giving us that trust. So, yeah, I will pause there.
Thank you so much, Neha. You just spoke so eloquently about all of the P's, right? From proximity to partnership to pathways to patterns of practice to power. So thank you for lifting up all of those pieces. For my final question, I'd love for you each to share a little bit about, this model of collaborative philanthropy is not meant to stay one way forever, right? We're always trying to improve, and the study also points to some areas of improvement. Where do you both see the future of collaborative philanthropy going? How can collaborative funds really improve their work, Sneha, so that you can feel even more supported? And Nikki, would love for your reflections as well for the whole field. Sneha, do you want to start?
Yes, I can start. So I would just say, especially as we are growing, we are in a very big growth stage as an organization. We're really excited about the prospect of more multi-year funding, even if it's smaller amounts, because one of the things for us is that we're really planning both in the short term, but as we matured in the last couple of years, we're really planning our long-term impact. And that having multi-year funding allows us to determine where we can bulk up staff capacity or where we can grow our existing programming. And that's where I also think collaborative funds have a really exciting and important role, is to be able to give just some sort of idea of how long the funding would be able to last so that we can plan as small organizations and also start to connect with other funders. And that's been really powerful from the Disability Inclusion Fund too, is being able to connect with other funders and have the trust of other funders because we have been supported by the Disability Inclusion Fund.
Thank you, Sneha. That makes a lot of sense. And to all the funders on the call who fund into collaboratives, I think this is also a testimony around why multi-year support from the funders themselves will then help strengthen the collaborative fund and eventually support longer term grant making for grantees like Generation Patients. So thank you so much, Sneha, for lifting that up. Nikki, what about you? Closing thoughts or reflections?
Well, there's so many thoughts and reflections, but one thing I will there's a couple of things I would like to point out. Part of what we do is we really trust our grantees. So, and one of the things that we do is we really try to stay out of their way. That's why we don't ask for like a lot of reporting. We will do like a video check-in over Zoom, as often as needed. We also we want to support our grantees, so we do a lot of capacity building, like what Sneha was talking about. And we really look to our grantees to tell us what they need. We're not about trying to like be like the authoritative funder who's like, you need to do this, you need to do that. We really just let them, we try to stay out of the way and let them do their work. Um, and I also feel like one of the things that's been really powerful for the fund is being able to really listen to the communities that we're working with. So, you know, we did our we had a big conference. We brought all of our grantees together in a convening last year. And one of the things that they told us is actually they wanted to do more work with each other. So, so this year we're piloting a collaborative grant making project in which grantees can work. We're going to fund work that grantees do with each other. So I really think that, our fund is going into its sixth year, and every year we always are listening to our grantees and thinking about what can we do different, what can we do better, what can we change, and we make those changes based on listening to our communities and the communities that we're serving. So, for example, this new collaborative grant project that we're working on, um, and also trying to do more multi-year funding. Um, always looking for new emerging groups that are doing the work. We really focus on new and emerging ideas because that's how we are going to advance disability justice around the country. And we're really committed to those ideas of how we actually advance the movement. And that's how when we're doing our grant making, we're always thinking about how is this grantee going to advance the movement of disability justice.
Thank you both, Nikki and Sneha, for joining us. Can we do a big round of Zoom reactions for both of them? This was really, really helpful to hear. And you got a lot of love in the chat for your matching green sweaters. So just wanted to share that with you. Thank you both for joining us. And now we're going to bring the rest of the co-authorship back to the stage to do our final piece of this. So let me get my ducks in a row and remove these spotlights. This is a good reminder that the Q&A is open and we have lots of space now to go through and answer questions. So please take a moment to answer your questions there. But before we do that, I know some folks might drop at the hour. So drum roll, please. We are so excited to share with everybody the link to the full report that you can read beyond what we shared on this, pretty quick Zoom here. There's lots more details around all of the Ps and how to implement them and more specifics from the CEP study as well. And so we welcome you all to find and read that report. And as Jess mentioned, we are going to be hosting funder-only spaces and collaborative fund-only spaces to continue the learning with more direct conversation. So please be in touch with us if you'd like to join one of those. And yeah, I think, Jen, thank you for sharing out the link here, but I think our team will continue to share the link for everyone to download the study. And with that, I'm going to turn it to Jess to lead our Q&A portion of our call.
Great. Thanks, Isis. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A. We will try to write answers to some of them, but we're going to tackle as many as we can during this last 15 minutes. I'm going to grab a few random or general ones and then tag in my teammates for some more specifics. So we had a number of comments about this being a US focused study and what's the applicability more broadly. Many of us would love to replicate or expand this study's methodology for collaboratives that are working in cross-border space. So if any funders are listening and would like to support that work, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We also had some questions about what are the role of individual donors versus institutional donors in these collaboratives. As someone who also operates as a donor advisor, I am passionate about helping individual donors navigate into the ecosystem and learn about the field they're funding in. And for many of them, funding collaborative funds is a really strategic way to do that. So we are going to host a webinar in February where individual donors and their donor advisors can join for a conversation about the unique challenges and opportunities that individual donors face in supporting this work. There was also a number of questions around the relationship between grantees, collaboratives, and the host intermediary organizations or fiscal sponsors. This was not a primary focus of our research, but we did hear about ways that hosts and fiscal sponsors can either support or impede the execution of the Ps, particularly in their own administrative processes and in the ways that they can support grantees with things like stipends and other supports. So there are some findings regarding that at the very end of our report, and we welcome more conversations with you about that. So with that, I would like to turn a question to Kathy, which is about our appreciative inquiry approach. I'm curious why you focused on funds you already felt were good models versus broadly looking at collaboratives overall to how they compare to direct funding. I ask because many funders work with collaboratives with the assumption they can do better grant making than funders directly. It's hard to test that assumption if we're only looking at best practices. What are your thoughts, Kathy?
Thanks, Jess, and for the question. This is a really important sort of feature of the study in that we did choose to look at the highest performing funds. And our reason for doing that is because we felt that there was a need for further defining what it is that actually is distinctive about collaborative funds. And so the first question is there anything special about this group of organizations? And if so, what should you be looking for when you're making those funding choices? And I think the really exciting thing about this research is that the answer is yes, that there is something pretty distinctive about it. And when done at that highest level, it really delivers an outsized impact, as we've been talking about throughout the study. This sets up then a series of additional questions. How prevalent is this model? Are there thresholds within the performance of each of these different characteristics? How do they interact? What's the most important thing to be looking for if you're a funder or if you're a fund organizer in making those trade-offs and decisions about how you balance this across your budget and the work that you do? And those types of questions now we are in a position to be able to answer because we've answered that first question, that collaborative funds are special when the collaborative effect sort of defines that really distinctive model for these organizations. And when done well, it really realizes that outsized impact. So more work to come.
Thanks, Kathy. We also have a couple questions about what can be both a beneficial and a fraught relationship in fundraising between grantees and fund leaders. So someone asked about the tension between pooled fund having to fundraise, and does that put them in competition with grantees who are also fundraising? Someone else who runs a fund on the call said we've received a critique that a donor collaborative can negatively impact grantees' overall fundraising because funders say, don't talk to us, go talk to this collaborative fund instead. Isis, what are you hearing from the research?
Yeah, I think those are both really important points, and that's why this work is so nuanced. And at the end of the day, I think, for many of the grantees being funded, they're smaller grassroots organizations that, frankly, a larger funder with larger grant sizes may not be at the moment where they're going to fund that group. And so for some, I think collaboratives provide an on-ramp to then eventually grow over time, as Sneha was sharing, right? Having started a small organization and hasn't been growing and continue to receive funding from the Disability Inclusion Fund, how can that then create on-ramps into getting other funder sources? On the second one around funders themselves saying, we already fund you through the collaborative, don't come to us. This is, a challenge overall, and I think it speaks broadly in philanthropy to this question of scarcity or abundance of resources, right? And what does that look like for us all, funders included, to really not just feel like they're funding a collaborative, therefore a box is being checked for a specific issue or community or geography, but rather it's part of a full strategy that they might be employing and really thinking bigger and bolder and more abundantly around what that could look like.
Thanks, Isis. We had a number of questions, Kathy. I'm going to turn to you on what works well in terms of above and beyond supports. So someone asked, what above and beyond grant supports did you see being most effective? Someone else asked specifically about peer learning cohorts and whether that was a common tool that was used by collaborative funds in the study. And sorry, that was a question for Catherine, not Kathy. Although you're both welcome to answer.
I was gonna say it's fun having two Catherines on the same team. Yeah, so I can absolutely share kind of what the survey results said about which above and beyond supports were helpful, and obviously that's in the report as well. So please read section or finding number 5 to learn more about that. But the big thing that grantees said actually was the opportunity to join convenings. The next thing was catalyzing, kind of to what Isis was just talking about, catalyzing relationships with other organizations in the field. The third kind of most valuable above and beyond support was catalyzing relationships with other funders in the field, so outside of their existing kind of ecosystem. And then the fourth was expert advice and support for our staff. And so you heard that also come up a lot in the Q&A with Nikki and Sneha.
Great. Thank you. David, I'm going to put you on the spot with this next one. This is actually one of the first comments that we got, which is how sustainable is 133 staff across 1,700 grantees? And I will just say we struggled with this because on the one hand, collaborative funds are incredibly efficient, and we wanted to highlight that. On the other hand, they could do more with more resources. So having a small staff isn't necessarily the best thing. David, what else did you hear in all of the conversations and research that you did?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Jess. What we heard repeatedly from grantees is that even though there are, obviously we want to be able to fund and resource the field broadly, but thinking through my thoughts here, I think it would continue to be helpful to fundraise and fund these organizations broadly. And then I'm kind of going through a cycle.
I can jump in here, David. So one stat to share here is that the Bridgespan research has found the sort of absorptive capacity of collaborative funds is really, really high. I mentioned the sort of group of, I think, 300 funds in their previous research that move 4 to 7 billion a year. They could move up to 20 billion a year without much added staff. And so I think that also applies to the collaborative funds in our study as well, that absorptive capacity could grow. They could all take on much more funding, serve more grantees without having to grow their staff. And yet, as Jess was mentioning, I think the tension is back to the room for growth finding that sometimes being so lean is just too difficult, right? That they're not able to communicate fully with their grantee partners. They're not able to provide the supports that they're hoping to support and what the grantees want to see. And so this is something that we hope this study can add into the ecosystem, is a broader and deeper conversation about both how to move more funding in, but also not keep the sort of never-ending loop of a lean team as a detractor from what they're trying to achieve.
Yes, and I'm happy to take another stab, but what we repeatedly heard from grantees is that it's fundamentally a both and. So we can continue to resource collaborative funds because of their efficacy, but also thinking through how effective these lean structures have been is an important part of their value add. So it doesn't mean that we should continue or starve of collaborative funds, but continue to find ways to creatively resource them and think through how they can continue to impact the field as well.
Thanks, David. I'm going to take a couple more. So there was a question around learning specific to the fund's funders. And we do have recommendations for funders in the report in more detail. But the key things that we heard, and the question actually prompted this, is the more flexible and multi-year funding that donors can give to collaborative funds, the more flexibility collaborative funds can then have with deploying those funds. And one of the pieces of research that was conducted last year by CEP comparing intermediaries more broadly to endowed foundations was that they did not do as much multi-year unrestricted support. And in general, we think that's a best practice in the field. If you talk to those funds, the reason they didn't do that is that they didn't have that support themselves, because often it is a shorter time frame. And so that's one of the main recommendations that we had for donors to collaborative funds. We had another question around whether this model is actually preferred by grantees over individual donors, and if so, why? And I think, that is in some ways at the heart of this research, which is from a grantee perspective, what's the experience? What we can say is that the cohort of funds that were selected as part of this study were in sort of par with the highest performing individual donors that CEP has surveyed. So that means that for grantees in this cohort, it's a really positive experience. Correlation doesn't mean causation. So any individual grantee might rather have money from a funder directly, but that is often not possible. So one of the things that was really interesting we actually didn't call out today is that there was very little overlap in grantees among the cohort that we selected, which means that these collaborative funds are reaching a huge swath of nonprofit organizations that are not being reached by individual funders or by other funds. And so in some ways, it's a little bit of a false dichotomy because many of the grantees of collaborative funds wouldn't necessarily be reached by individual donors on their own. Isis, I'm going to direct the next question to you, which is a question about the overlap between language on intermediary funders and collaborative funds. I know Philanthropy Together has done a lot of work on the research about these two terms. And also that question referenced the research that I just mentioned that CEP did last year around intermediaries more broadly. Would love to hear your thoughts on the difference in nomenclature there.
Woo, language is so confusing. And honestly, continues to be refined by the field itself on a yearly basis. So intermediated giving can happen in so many different ways, right? That's when any group or individual is receiving funding from others and then doing the grant making. But that can honestly apply to so many different models. That's everything from large international NGOs who have sort of other local grant making that they do. That can be applied to fiscal sponsors or honestly DAFs or giving circles or all of the giving tech platforms out there that are technically aggregating and playing an intermediated role to the grantees on the ground. What we were looking at here is really the subset of collaborative funds specifically, which, as we described in the beginning, have a more defined and specific model that is really much closer to a group of funders or donors coming together, but then there is a supported staff that is, as Nikki was sharing, either using their own staff or community expertise or their funder expertise in certain ways to then provide support to a set of grantees. All of the funds in the study and many of the others across the Bridgespan database also provide above and beyond support beyond just the grant making. So yes, the previous CEP research did look at a set of funders who had tagged themselves as intermediaries, but that was much broader. And so it's not surprising that the findings there were very mixed. And for us, we were really trying to look apples to apples, again, to Kathy's point around appreciative inquiry, to be able to pull out and find the lessons and the learnings that the broader field can then apply.
Thanks, Isis. We have a question around that stat that was not as positive around the lack of clarity on application and administration because and the question was, is that because collaboratives are balancing funding requirements as well, or do funders buy into the collaboratives processes? This is such an interesting question. We don't have definitive data to say this is why these funds were perceived as less clear. We have a few hypotheses. I'll offer my own, and then I will invite my colleagues to chime in. So the first one is that when you are sharing power through participatory decision making, that can be a really nuanced process. And so if you have a very clear, open RFP and a very clear, simple selection process, it's easy to contribute. If you have a group of field leaders making decisions together, that can be harder to articulate. And so the nature of this type of work can make transparency more difficult. The other hypothesis we have is that these collaboratives are just operating with really small, lean teams. And so the level of transparency and sort of grantee and field communication that you might want to see isn't as present. But I'm curious around other colleagues if you want to jump in here on that lack of transparency question.
Few thoughts in addition, Jess, on that. One, this gets back to the lean staff question. And, we found that the collaboratives through their lean staff were able to build incredibly strong relationships with less interaction. One consequence of that, though, can be that there's less time to sort through some of these nuances, and it can lead to a level of confusion. And so I think that that's one thing to look at. The other is that we did see that collaborative funds consistently talked about all of the burden that they take on to be that intermediating voice between the demands and needs of the funders and the needs of the field. And in doing that negotiation, creating systems that can meet the needs of the funders as well as streamline things for the grantees, it's easy to see how some confusion can come in. And so this is one of those spaces, I think, where additional funding would be particularly helpful to address some of the pressures that the organizations are under so that they have more time to increase the clarity of what it is that they're doing with their grantees.
Thank you. That's really helpful. One of the questions that we received is that someone said in an anonymous survey following a collaborative funding effort, there was feedback that some new leaders felt funds unfairly preference long-standing relationships, making it harder for new partners to be eligible for funding. We had another question around, so many funds are invitation only. How can I get on the radar? I think from the research team's perspective, this is really tricky because there is no one size fits all approach to grant making. And so for some of these funds, it is a relational process where they're reaching out to folks they already know in their communities versus doing an open call and an RFP, which is also a really common methodology in funds. Isis, can I call on you to elaborate on that a little bit more? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, just this is a challenge in philanthropy overall, right? That relationships as they progress, you can't help as a grant officer, a program officer, sort of continue to want to fund some of those longstanding pieces. And so I think this is, I haven't seen like a perfect answer for how to resolve this, but I do think it's a tension that we should be talking about, especially because we name relationships as really fundamental to this whole cycle. And so if those relationships then impede others from being able to get access, that certainly isn't going to serve anyone. I mean, I hate to say like more funding will solve it, but to some extent, because we know these collaborative funds can absorb more capital and they want to be doing more work to fund more grantees, I think there is an opportunity there to matchmake, especially because collaboratives overall are a great pathway for high net wealth individuals to fund more because of the direct proximity and experience on the ground that don't require an individual to have a full strategy in an issue area or for a certain community to be able to bring in more dollars and be able to direct them. And hopefully in that way, collaboratives can continue to bring in new voices. But I do believe this is a call to action for the collaborative funds overall.
Thanks, Isis. I think we've tackled most of the questions that were shared with us. We'll try to continue to answer some of them popping up in the chat. I just want to thank everyone who attended today. So as a next step, we have dropped the link to the report in the chat. We will also be sending a follow-up email to everyone who registered for this webinar with the slides from the webinar and a link to both the report and the executive summary. I'm also dropping links to LinkedIn, to our social media for Philanthropy Together, Vital Impact, and Redstone Strategy. We would love to hear from you, your feedback about the study, your questions about the study, how you will intend to use these findings. And as we've mentioned, we will continue throughout 2026 to have smaller group conversations to really help the field put some of these findings into practice. I want to extend a warm thank you to all of the speakers and to the participants in our panel. Thank you for attending, and we hope that you will join us again in the future.
Thank you, Jess, so much. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, David. We'll see you all soon.
Thank you.